Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Senturus Knowledge Series. Today, we are pleased to be presenting to you on the topic of Azure Synapse versus Snowflake, comparing analytic data clouds. So our agenda today, after some quick introductions, we'll get into the heart of the presentation, our Azure Synapse versus Snowflake comparisons. And then stick around for a very brief Senturus overview for those of you who may not be familiar with what we offer, and additional free resources, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So I'm pleased to be joined today by several of my esteemed colleagues, Bob Looney, Reeve Smith, and Gary Locke. Mr. Looney leads our software development and BI architecture efforts here at Senturus, focusing on software and cloud architecture with Snowflake, Power BI, and Tableau. Prior to Senturus, Bob was designing, building, and scaling BI software, reports, and dashboards for use by thousands of restaurants. Reeves is a certified master, Microsoft certified master and Snowflake SnowPro advanced architect with more than 20 years of experience working on various development and data warehouse projects within a large variety of industries. And last but not least, Gary Locke is a versatile solution architect here at Senturus, bringing over 20 years of experience ranging across multiple industries and disciplines. He's an MBA with end-to-end expertise in BI who enjoys combining his background in business with the latest technologies in data and analytics. My name is Mike Weinhauer. I'm a director here at Senturus. Among my myriad responsibilities, I have the pleasure of hosting our Knowledge Series webinars. And before we get, the last thing here, before we get into the main presentation, we like to always ask our audience a question and get a sense for what they're up to relative to this presentation. And our question today is, where is your data stored now? Pretty easy one, 3 choices, either on-prem, VM-based into the cloud, i.e. sort of lift and shift, or are you using a cloud-native app such as Snowflake or Azure Synapse? All right, looks good. And we'll share this back. So most of you still on-prem, about 2/3 there. Quarter of y'all using cloud-native apps though, and then the rest doing lift and shift. So always interesting to see what our clients and the folks joining our webinars are doing in their own organizations. So thank you again for sharing those insights with us. And then without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone and the floor over to Bob, Reeves, and Gary. Gentlemen, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the introduction there. Looking forward to sharing some great content about Azure Synapse and Snowflake here, some discussions with Gary and Reeves as we go through these various comparison points. So both are great tools. We've started working with them with clients, and as we've done so, started discovering some of these interesting, oh, this works like this other one works like in a different way type comparisons. And so we've tried to pull those together into this webinar to share that information and maybe help you along with your decision-making process if that's where you're at. So we're going to run through these points and talk through and do a couple demos as we go. So we're going to start with just kind of general overview of the platforms. They're both cloud-based kind of data cloud, data analytic cloud platforms. That means they're highly scalable and you get these demand-based computing resources, just your classic cloud advantages to being on platforms like this. They both support the idea of creating SQL databases so that as you kind of curate and structure your known data from raw data, you can get that into a SQL database, and it's optimized. All the technology under the covers is optimized for analytical purposes. And these architectures cover your typical use cases that you're going to see in your environments these days, which is covering things like classic BI, burstable reporting, some of those type things. It covers self-service use cases as well as your data science and AI, ML type use cases as well. So we'll touch on some of those points as we go through the webinar. So Gary, I'm going to hit you up to kind of give us a little bit deeper dive into kind of Azure Synapse's architecture here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. Sure. So with Azure Synapse, really, it brings together in one platform features and components that are available elsewhere individually in Azure and the Microsoft platform. But within Azure Synapse, you access it all from one workspace in the Azure portal. So within the workspace, there's different components for ETL and storing and accessing data, compute resources, and database technologies. So for ingesting data into Azure Synapse, a flavor of Azure Data Factory is included, which is Microsoft's modern ETL tool and really a great replacement for SSIS if you use that. For storing data and files, there's Azure Data Lake Storage, which is integrated and is Microsoft's highly scalable cloud storage platform. For compute, Azure Synapse actually includes multiple different analytics pools. First being the serverless SQL pool, which allows you to use T-SQL to directly access data in your lake. And that can be like CSV files or Parquet files, or you can even hit multiple files that are stored within folders. Besides that, there's a dedicated SQL pool, which is Microsoft's massively parallel processing engine, previously known as SQL Data Warehouse. And that's really designed for handling the largest of data warehouses. It's good for when you have more predictable usage patterns and you have like higher compute utilization. And with the dedicated SQL pool, your data is actually stored in a database and can be accessed using T-SQL, stored procedures, things like that. And also there's Apache Spark. So Microsoft has a serverless version of Apache Spark in the cloud, which allows you parallel processing framework that supports in-memory processing of your data. And then finally, within Azure Synapse is analytics as well. So of course, Azure Synapse integrates with Power BI, and there's also some Azure machine learning capabilities in there as well.
Great, that's a great overview. I'm going to slide in a logged in Synapse Analytics workspace and let you kind of walk us through a couple pieces and parts in a real environment here.
Sure. So accessing the workspace from the Azure portal, this is basically your home page. So, there's always things changing here down below, but over in the left menu, you can see it's really easy, kind of broken into components. So let's start actually in the bottom. So if you click Manage, here, as you can see up top, and we'll get into a lot of this more later, but you can see it's all within one workspace. You can get to your different analytics pools. You can set up link services with all types of external connections. And then once you start getting into integrations, you can set up different integration runtimes and trigger them via schedule. You have integrated security with Azure Active Directory and things like that. You can pull in code libraries for working with Spark, and then we'll get into this a bit more later, but source control as well with Git. And then, once you do get things fired up, there's the ability to monitor and see how things are running and stuff like that. But let's see, yeah, we'll get into more of that later. But this is definitely, the important thing here is that it's a single workspace that really gives you access to everything in one place.
Great, thanks for the overview. All right, Reeves, we're going to toss it over to you to talk to the Snowflake architecture a little bit and maybe do a little bit of comparing and contrasting there.
Okay, thanks, Bob. So Snowflake, it's a little bit different, and some of that difference is that Snowflake concentrates more on the database side and leaves the tooling and that kind of stuff for other partners in the space. And part of that reason is, as you can see in the center with data, where we talk about data lake, it's from each of the three cloud providers. So, excuse me, Snowflake runs on all three of the cloud providers, and because of that, they don't have the ability to create, or they do, but they could, but they choose to concentrate on the database engine and allow the providers that are cross-platform to deal with the different cloud providers. So it's kind of a little bit of a different concept from that standpoint. It is a database and a compute, and they call compute in Snowflake a warehouse. So it's kind of a misused or multi-use term that can have some confusion. So when we say we spin up a warehouse, is what we're saying is we're spinning up compute. So that's the Snowflake side. They are able to integrate with any of the data lake, like an S3, an Azure storage, or Google Cloud storage. So you're able to ingest data through the data lake, and you're able to use any of those ETL tools that are cross-platform. So, and
Great.
if we're talking to the UI, yeah, no, that's fine. And we're talking to the UI. As you can see, it's very similar, but it's just from a SQL development type standpoint. If you look, we have current database to the left. You can write your basic SQL statements. Those certain databases have, it's the same concept as it's the same concept that it's database schema and tables, just like every other database. It doesn't use different language than what you're used to on your on-premises databases. But with that, you're able to change compute. And if you click over to the warehouses, we'll talk about that for a second.
Okay.
The warehouses, yeah, right there. As you can see, we've created 2 warehouses here, and you can create as many as you need. And here's a really cool feature of Snowflake. I can create a warehouse for any department, so I can track departmental costs very easily. And there's no cost with spinning up, or there's no cost with creating warehouses. They have the spin up time, or they have the ability to spin up on demand and then auto suspend based on some settings that you can set there, or you can auto suspend it yourself. But it allows you to scale up compute very easily. If you have something running, and it's not working on an extra small, you could spin that compute up, and right now you can spin it up to a 4XL, which has quite a bit of processing power. So, but the nice part is they have that auto suspend, so they turn off when they're not in use, and you can set that auto suspend from whenever you'd like.
Absolutely. One of the best features.
Yes. So, and then that one piece to finish it off, if you click on Partner Connect,
Sure.
over to the right. Yep. There you go. And here's where you can integrate those partners into Snowflake. So if you wanted to use a Fivetran, you can come here, and it just has some steps that'll walk you through a little easier because it already is somewhat if you're kicking it off, it's from your account. So
there's a semi-integration there with some of these tools, it seems like.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks. We're going to dive deeper a little bit later, but that's a great intro. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the next thing we're going to talk to is kind of wide, robust tooling. These are both, leaders in this space. So they both have, solid web interfaces for management. They support major third-party tools for data analytics and ETL. They have ODBC drivers and command line tools as well for automation, things like that. You can see the 3 visualization tools that Senturus partners with there at the bottom, all heavily support all 3 of these platforms very, very well. So if you're having issues connecting Snowflake with Cognos or Tableau or something like that, we're more than happy to help with those types of issues. So Gary, let's dive a little bit deeper into the Synapse kind of workspace overview and show us how you maybe use this in a development environment.
Sure. So we briefly touched on this already, but so the Synapse workspace, the web development interface has seen a lot of recent investment and updates. And within the workspace, you really have access to end-to-end BI capabilities, and there's features for like data engineering, data science, data visualization. As I mentioned, for data engineering, you have Azure Data Factory baked into the workspace. It's not 100% full Azure Data Factory, as if you've ever worked with it, you'll notice there are some slight differences, but it's pretty full featured. So with Azure Data Factory, you have a ton of functionality for transforming and moving data. For example, so here's in a pipeline, allows you to really orchestrate some of the transformations that you've made. Actually, if you don't mind, Bob, can you go over to develop and
Absolutely.
show a data flow?
Data flow to start. All right.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
So data flow features a nice replacement for SSIS and has actually very easy drag and drop interface. So once you connect to a source, so of course within Synapse, your source can be like, I think there's 90 different types of sources. But once you have a connection to your source, that's good to show that. If you can click that plus sign there. And as you can see here, once you have a connection to your source, you can see all the different transformation activities that are available. So this is similar to like an SSIS, and where you can start getting into things like joining and doing lookups and aggregations and pivots and unpivots. And basically you can string activities together within this drag and drop workspace to make it very user-friendly. And really most of the transformation activities in here are available without you having to do any real coding. Occasionally you might want to pass parameters back and forth, create variables, things like that, but for the most part, it's like drag and drop. Otherwise, on this develop side, you can write SQL scripts directly against your SQL pool, or you can actually work with your data directly in an Apache Spark pool via a notebook.
Yep. So we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, in the web browser, you can interact directly with your data, which is great.
Even kind of gives you a little bit of the code pre-written as you get ready to go here.
Exactly. Yep, and then as you had showed below, with the integrations, when you start getting into pipelines, is where you can really orchestrate all kinds of activities, including your data flows, Synapse notebooks. You can actually integrate with Azure Functions, Databricks notebooks, use SQL scripts, web APIs, stored procedures, and even there's some machine learning down at the bottom there. Yep. Yeah, so it's you can see you can get to a ton of different things depending on what your expertise is and what you're already using within your environment. And then also, as you're working in here, you can integrate directly into Git. So up on the top there, see we're working in the dev branch, but you can actually save and commit your changes directly into Git, which is very nice and was a quick setup. And I guess as a last note, with the SQL pools, whether dedicated or serverless, you can also work in SQL Management Studio if that's where you're comfortable, or Azure Data Studio. So you can connect just like you would connect to any other database. So that's a nice feature. Although when you do start working in there, you will realize that it's not 100% like working with like an Azure SQL database or an on-prem SQL database. Some of the features are different or just aren't there.
Great. Thanks. All right, Reeves, let's talk a little bit about Snowflake and how you're going to develop against Snowflake.
Alrighty. Like I showed with the web UI, you can do a lot of your development within the web UI, but there's not really any integration. So what I mean by that is code source integration. So there's a tool that I use. Let's see.
Yeah, we're seeing it. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. So there's a tool that I like to use, and it's DataGrip, and it's a really full-featured UI for working with databases. And as you can see, I can do all the same things that I was doing from within the Snowflake UI. But now I'm able to change or track those changes very easily because this tool integrates very well with Git, and I'm able to see and commit changes as I'm going along. And another nice feature that it gives you is code completion. I can see I must have typed something incorrectly here, and I'm like, oh, it's DemoDB. I can come in here, update that, and this UI understands that, okay, those fields are now valid, and it's not. It kind of helps you out. So I think that's kind of a nice piece to this. And then I can make that commit, right? I can come in here and I can, oops, that's the, oh, maybe I didn't have that, but I can make a commit here on that code change and then save that up to my source code repository. That is the one thing that the UI doesn't give us, right? And the UI from here, I can't keep this code or put this code into a repository without cutting and pasting it out. So right now that's a small limitation with the way that their UI is kind of set up. So that's where I like the tools like, a DataGrip that allows me to do that kind of stuff, and I can keep my projects and I can, deal with any type of database, right? I don't have to just be dealing with a Snowflake database. I can deal with any of the other providers. So I can set up a connection there. So this environment I think is really, really nice for working with Snowflake.
Love it. And yeah, I would assume with both of those, you could then just layer on your kind of CI/CD processes as far as promoting changes to staging and
Right.
things like that that you'd have in a typical enterprise environment.
Right. And then with the other tools, like what I showed on the, what is it, the marketplace, the data marketplace? No, the other tab, sorry, the Partner Connect.
Yes,
You'll be using the interface that they have with those. So
gotcha. All right, well, let's move along and let's talk a little bit how these two tools are Paas versus SaaS, so platform as a service versus software as a service. If you're unfamiliar with those terms, I like this Microsoft provided graphic here that kind of talks about where each of the kind of three commonly used terms there end. But it is a key differentiator here. For reasons we're going to talk about. So Gary, I'm going to let you go ahead and talk about the Azure Synapse side of being a platform as a service.
Sure. So, being a platform, it is kind of a collection of Azure resources, which I mentioned earlier. They are available individually, but this brings them together really as a platform. So, as you go into the Azure portal and you want to fire up Azure Synapse, you're basically, creating some different resources within Azure. So you'll want to either choose an existing or create like a resource group, and at the same time you'll spin up Azure Data Lake Storage as well as your SQL pool. Yep. So here's
Yep.
here's the setup page that you would walk through, and you would choose your subscription. And like I said, either you would choose an existing or create a new resource group, and then set up a workspace, choose the region. And one thing we did find is, as we were kind of talking about this and working on the webinar, it's interesting to see that the pricing for some of these features are actually different in different regions. So like a West US 2 versus a West US, the pricing can be different. So depending on where you're doing your work and where some of your other services are held, you might want to consider that. But really at its core, once you fire up Azure Synapse, at its core, you're starting off with a serverless SQL pool, Azure Data Lake Storage, and an Azure Integration Runtime. So I don't know if you want to bounce over to the actual environment that you had spun up already.
Okay.
Perfect, and go to Manage. And up top under Analytics Pools, go SQL Pool. Yeah, so when you start off, you're going to start off with a serverless SQL pool. It's called built-in. This one cannot be deleted. So it's kind of it's there for you when you need it. And with the serverless side, it's similar to Snowflake in some ways, in that it's great for ad hoc querying of data within your lake. So you can use T-SQL without having to reserve any capacity in a dedicated SQL pool. But also here within the SQL pools, you can fire up a dedicated SQL pool or multiple of each. And then under analytics pools is where you could also fire up an Apache Spark pool, depending on if that's what your needs are.
Great. And one thing we found is what these dedicated SQL pools, they kind of tie one-to-one with the database. Is that the right way to think of that?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and I'll get into that a little more later, but that's
Okay.
yeah, that's definitely the case. And then we get into pricing a little bit more later, just to give a little more background on that.
Perfect.
But so you have the SQL pools, and then down below you see external connections. So that's just a great feature within here with linked services. So when you initially start off, you'll have two linked services. One is connecting to Azure Synapse Analytics, so you're kind of your SQL pool, and also to your Azure Data Lake Storage. So that allows you to start doing integrations between those two environments. But you can also add linked services to like 90 other things. And those, yeah, that's great. So, within Azure, you can connect to like Blob Storage or Cosmos DB, or if you just want to connect to an Azure SQL database, maybe you have some transactional data out there, you can do that. If you want to use additional compute, you can connect to Azure Databricks or an Azure Function, Azure Machine Learning. On the database side, you can actually connect to like Amazon Redshift, DB2, Google BigQuery, or Oracle. And then with files, if you have some data that's outside of Azure, you can actually connect to S3. You can connect to Google Cloud Storage. Yep, perfect.
Exactly.
And then also, when you start off, you'll start off with one integration runtime, which is basically in Azure, a place where compute happens. But you can also spin up additional integration runtimes here, whether they be in Azure or self-hosted, which you can have an on-prem server that allows you to do some types of activities there as well.
And these integration runtimes, these are for pulling in on-prem data in this case?
You can, yeah. So if you did have
almost like a gateway?
Yep, like it's similar to a gateway, like in Power BI, where you set it up to point or work on an on-prem server, and then so like recently I worked with a client that had data on-prem in an Oracle database, and you basically set up that runtime, and then pretty quickly you're working with on-prem data and pulling it in, and then transforming it and working it in with other types of data as well.
Great, thank you. All right, Reeve, same thing, but let's talk about software as a service now.
Alrighty. So let me have, I got a screen. Let me share the screen. So Snowflake takes a little bit different approach, right? It is abstracting as much of that as it can to just make configuration a little bit easier. And as you can see, similar to the pricing that we were looking at from a Synapse standpoint, you have the same kind of idea here, except for a big is you can pick any of the cloud providers, right? I can do AWS, Azure, or Google platform. And why that becomes important is as you're searching for a cloud, if you're searching for a cloud database, you don't have to go with the provider based on the cloud. You can pick what you want to do, and then you can pick the cloud that is most relevant to you. And where I see that is if you have a lot of data lake assets already out there in a cloud, you don't have to move those data assets out of that cloud and into a new cloud. You can just go, you can set up Snowflake within that region, and you can actually set up Snowflake within any region, right? And you can set up multiple. You can have Snowflake in AWS, you can have Snowflake in Azure, and they can actually replicate between each other. But with Snowflake, is what you're doing is you pick a region, and you pick a provider, you pick a region, and then you basically decide, what level of features you'd need from a standpoint of, do I just need standard, enterprise, business critical, or VPS? And those features just come at a per cost or a cost per credit basis. So your credits just cost a little bit more as you need more features. So these three are pretty standard. This one is if you decide I want to be in my own VPC, I do not want to share the VPC with anybody, and that comes with, this is a little bit different, and it creates and makes some changes on availability of resources as well. But these three are the pretty standard ones, and then you just pay per monthly charge on storage. So there is there, if you could say, buttons and knobs to turn are very limited from a standpoint of you just pay per credit while resources are running, and you just pay you just pay a storage fee per month. So it's kind of a little bit different from that standpoint. But that allows you to, you're not managing it as much, right? And what I mean by that, and the big feature that we'll talk about, is Snowflake doesn't have indexes. And to anyone that's worked in a database, they might be going, oh my word, but I can attest to the fact that I've worked on a petabyte scale databases, and they perform very well. I've got, queries where we were running, multi-billion row records, and they were coming back, in very quickly. So that's not necessarily an issue, which allows you to concentrate on just getting the requirements done and not having to worry as much about tuning.
Sure. I found that use case interesting, where you could replicate your databases across clouds, but still be in the in a Snowflake, very familiar Snowflake environment.
Right, and it could be an easy migration path, right? So I could migrate my data over via replication and then turn off the previous cloud if I wanted to. So it lends some unique ideas where you're not necessarily tied to a cloud provider. You can move, You can move within the 3 cloud providers fairly easy. Yeah, no, that's a really cool use case.
All right, so we're going to keep talking a little bit more about architecture, at least as it pertains to compute. And this is a little down the weeds, a little technical, but it's also very important to understand why these two systems are different. So, you need compute capacity anytime you're performing any actions on your data. And then in both systems, and we'll talk a little bit deeper on pricing, but capacity is always priced as by how much you use, how long you use it, and then at what performance level you're looking for out of the system. So Gary, will you dive deep with us a little bit on kind of how Azure is approaching compute capacity with Synapse?
Sure. So of course, within Azure Synapse, there's multiple options when it comes to compute, but focusing specifically on dedicated SQL pool, which, as I mentioned, is Microsoft's parallel processing engine within SQL. So there's some interesting things to note. First one, as you mentioned, Bob, a dedicated SQL pool aligns with one SQL database. And then also that database can only be accessed when the SQL pool is running, which is different than the serverless SQL pool, which is always available. But the dedicated SQL pool can be scaled, stopped, and resumed either manually or via the portal. Manually via the portal or programmatically via an API. And then also you can isolate and prioritize your actions using workload groups within the pool, so that loads don't take up too many resources, or maybe one individual doesn't take up a lot of resources either. But really, thinking of architecture and under the covers, as you can see in this screenshot here, the way it works is that there's a control node that handles orchestrating your queries and passing operations to compute nodes. And then really those compute nodes perform the work in parallel, using between 1 and 60 different nodes, depending on the service level you choose. So if you have the lowest level of service, you'll have 1 node, and if you pay for the highest level of service, you'll have 60. So it splits your queries into 60 smaller queries. So running the queries in parallel, of course, is where you get the performance boost. But then also, with a dedicated SQL pool, your data is actually stored and managed in Azure Storage. So when you go into that database and you're creating tables for your data warehouse, you actually have the ability to choose a distribution method for each table within the database. And I won't get into the details here, but you have 3 options. There's hash, there's round robin, and replicate. And basically the different distribution methods available, they each have pros and cons, and based on the size and usage of the data within the table. And this kind of gets into what Reeves was mentioning about, do you want fewer settings? Do you want more settings? So this gives you the ability to make those fine tunes that you might want to make. And I'm not trying to knock Snowflake at all here, but the black box approach a lot of times is great until it's not great, and then you're like, well, what's it actually doing? And then you don't have that ability. So just definitely something to consider there.
Thanks. And so just to clarify, you were saying the performance setting, you're going to get more nodes and more kind of resources as you scale up.
Exactly.
Your overall dedicated SQL pool. All right.
Right.
Thank you. And so Reeves, on the Snowflake side, it's a little different.
Yeah, you have the concept of compute, and it is completely independent. You can have as many as you want running. I would imagine there's some actual limit, but you can have quite a few warehouses running, and they can access the same data, and you don't have to worry about doing data federation or moving data out into different nodes. It handles all of that because it's using basically S3 or Azure Storage. So it's letting Azure Storage and those services that are able to provide multiple connections to the same data, and it doesn't have to worry about that. So it can set up these multiple computes like warehouse so that you can access that data. So you can run your data transformation during the day without any concern, and it will not interfere with the other warehouses. So it's a little bit different from that standpoint, and it has the ability to scale, to scale out. I can create a warehouse that has multiple nodes associated to it. And as demand increases, those nodes can be added in, or we could say more warehouses are added in to handle that load, and then they will spin down as they're not needed. So it's pretty nice from that standpoint. I can also scale up and scale down to bring more compute into what data transformation or data query that I might need. So it's different from that standpoint, and it's like we're saying, it's less knobs, and that can be kind of scary, but I've been in enough situations where I've seen that I haven't had to. I mean, they have a somewhat of an option which is called clustering, which enables better pruning of the data, but we haven't seen the need to do that in huge data sets. So I mean, you can have some benefit in doing it for sure, but it hasn't been what I would term as needed because the performance wasn't there. So just a little bit different from that standpoint.
Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to see how they took two different approaches to both solving this idea of contention and, hey, I want to load data while other users are querying data. And they kind of both got there slightly different ways, but both systems work well as well. So, all right, going to touch on a couple system-specific things now. So we'll start with Azure Synapse. And Gary, I think we kind of already did a short demo here of this one, but if you want to keep talking to this.
Sure. Yeah, this will be brief. I mean, this is just one thing that's nice in Azure Synapse is the Apache Spark pool. So if your team's expertise or preferences working directly in a Spark notebook, and say you want to quickly load SQL tables into data frames, you can spin up an Apache Spark pool and develop in Python or Scala or C# or Spark SQL, and it's accessible right in the Synapse workspace. And then, of course, the data involved here and the notebooks can be integrated with data flows and other activities within a pipeline. So when you start scheduling your jobs to run, you have multiple different computes you can use, with Apache Spark being one of them. And actually, in a similar fashion, you can set up a linked service to Azure Databricks as well and develop in a Databricks notebook or a Python file there.
Yeah, it really just kind of depends on your team's capabilities and what technologies you prefer, but it seems like you can get to just about anything you want to use, all in that same environment. Very, very slick. And Reeves, you want to talk on a couple Snowflake specifics?
Sure. Pass me back the screen and
yes.
I'll kind of walk through a demo. And what we're going to show here is, I'm going to show kind of two things real quick. Is we're going to talk about cloning, which is a unique feature to Snowflake. But to kind of set that up, I'm gonna start back a little. I'm gonna back up a little bit and kind of just show kind of a performance thing. So to kind of just do that. So I'm going to create or replace this table, which means I just created this table and there's no data in it, right? So run, you can see there's no data in this table. So I'm going to load this in via the copy command, which there are files that we have out on Azure Storage that we're going to grab and load into this table. So I'm going to kick that off, and that's going to take a second. As you can see, it's running. This is loading a little bit of ETL, or this is doing a little bit of ETL into that table, and it's going to take, I think, around 20 seconds, somewhere around there. But I'm going to show you then how many rows were in that. And as we saw when we first ran this, there were no rows, right? So we now have we have these files that loaded, and to kind of show you from a performance standpoint, we just loaded in 37 million records in, what was the amount of time? If I go back, 24 seconds. And that is on, as you can see, we're on an extra small warehouse. So that's a $2 an hour charge. So I think if I were to do the math on that one, it was pennies to just load that, right? And there's no sleight of hand here. I haven't sorted anything. I haven't done anything. And if I were to just look at aggregations among that 37 million rows, you can see that comes back in less than a second, and I just aggregated all that data in less than a second. So from a performance standpoint, I want to say Snowflake's is off the charts, but let's just pretend that this data is our production data, and we want to run some tests. We want to run some, you know, some tests or some scripts against that test data. But it's like, how do we always do it? Because in dev, we never have the, you know,
Yeah,
the
the
same
classic
amount of
problem.
data. Yeah, exactly. The same
I
amount of data.
can't replicate it, the bug in dev. What do I do?
Exactly, because my 3-row data set just works every time. So what's a nice part that you can do in Snowflake is I can create a database that is a clone of that database, and it's a metadata operation, so it happens very quickly. And as you can see, the current demo was not over here, and if I refresh, I now have a current demo. And I have a table in here, and if I were to preview that table, you can see that I have that 37 million rows. So all of a sudden, I've just created that exact same thing. So if I were to now go in and update that query, which will take a second or two because it is a update over that 37 million rows. I think it's 500,000 rows that I need to update. So it takes, yeah, 500,000 rows. And I'm going to steal that ID. Oh, I'm going to steal that ID. And then go back, because I didn't mean to do that. I'm going to put it there. This is just sleight of hand, okay? So I've got so if I want to look at what the current demo shows from a price standpoint, I can see that I'm at about $23, right? Because my process that I was doing here was my ETL-ish or my machine learning or my whatever, you know, increase the price for just this customer was my scenario. So I can see that that price has been affected, and then I can go back to the demo database and I can see that nothing's been affected. So I'm able to run these transformations against that production data set. And is what ends up happening is I only create micropartitions of the ones that I changed. So you're still using that same, you're still having access to that same data that's in this database, along with all the records that you changed in here. So it's keeping the differential and understanding how to piece those things back together. So you haven't hurt production at all. I haven't touched this at all, so nothing has changed there. And you know, that's really cool from a testing standpoint. I can test against the exact same thing that I'm seeing in production. And if I want to see both of the results together, right, I can query both of them at the same time. I can see the difference between the two. And then just as an example of time travel, I still have access to go back. If you remembered, I grabbed that query ID. I can say, what did this query look like prior to this query ID? So if I do that, I'll see the exact same data that's in my production database, because I'm saying, what did it look like prior to that when that execution ran? So it opens up a whole new way of being able to test, because you're able to test against your production data very easily. And then I can drop that database and be done with it. And now it's gone. And I haven't affected production at all. Let me just prove that by nothing in production has changed. So that's kind of a neat feature. That's kind of a neat feature for Snowflake is data, or is the cloning and the time travel. So
yeah, it's pretty slick.
Yeah. I think we've already touched on this last point here, the less administration versus Synapse having kind of more settings and more configuration ability. So let's talk pricing just a little bit. We tried to put together something high level to, pricing is so customer specific, but we did want to touch on how it works. We've already talked a little bit on some of this, but compute and storage are billed separately on both products, and it's consumption-based compute, as we've talked about, all about how long you use it and how powerful it is when you're using it. And then that last point, there are options to pre-purchase or reserve some of these resources to save you money. So if you're using them and you're running them all the time, then think about that. So Gary, you want to kind of walk us through here the Synapse approach to pricing?
Sure. Yeah, and this pricing is focused specifically on pricing related to the Azure Synapse SQL pools, and not anything else that's available, like transformations or other integrated services. But For the most part, pricing is broken down into 3 different components, as you mentioned. First being compute. So for the dedicated SQL pool, I mentioned earlier, you choose a service level based on your needs. So within those service levels, they have what they call data warehousing units. As you can see in the screenshot there, the smallest being 100. And you can see there it starts at $1.20 an hour. You can scale all the way up to, I think it costs like $360 an hour. And that's where you get the full, 60 nodes and things like that. But the one thing with dedicated SQL pool, if you know you're going that route and you want to reserve space, Microsoft does offer up to like, I think, a 65% discount with 3-year reserve pricing. But depending on your needs, you can land anywhere kind of in between that lowest and highest amount. With the serverless SQL pool, it's pretty simple. It's $5 per terabyte of data processed. Since you're not really storing data in a database, you're really just consuming data directly against your data lake. So that makes it a little bit easier, but there's different pros and cons to that, of course. Within the dedicated SQL pool, you are storing data in your database. So with that, it's like $23 per terabyte of data process. You can see on a note there, and kind of what's included in the data storage. And then with both varieties, you're consuming raw file storage that's in your data lake. And you can see the screenshot there. It's like, I think 15 cents per gigabyte in their premium tier. So there's different components and different pieces to the pricing.
Yep, lots of nuances for each organization. And Reeves, you kind of touched on some of the additions and credit pricing here earlier. Anything to add here?
No, just, yeah, you're paying basically compute costs and storage costs. There are egress costs that everybody has to pay for if you're egressing data in and out. But if you're all within the same provider, that's not going to be a cost that you have to pay for. But it is a cost that could happen. But it's pretty straightforward, and they have, I think, as I was showing on that screen, a little bit discounted price if you buy storage. If you pre-buy storage, I should say.
Gotcha.
And one thing that I was thinking about is you can also query within Snowflake. I didn't mention it. You can query within Snowflake data that is in your data lake without having to bring it into Snowflake. Once it lands in Snowflake, the cost is fairly minimal. So that if there's, the reason I would see is if you wanted to look at files but don't look at them very often and just don't want to bring them into your system, I can set up what they call external tables. And those external tables, I can query the data in the data lake without bringing it in.
Gotcha. So we tried to mock up a couple of just use cases, and again, your mileage may vary based off your organization. But in this first example, we just said, okay, well, let's pick the smallest compute that you can spin up on each platform, and let's assume a 1 terabyte SQL database, and kind of ignore all other cost, and just that you run that compute all the time. And so that's kind of what your monthly cost breakdown looks like in that case. You can argue fair or not fair based off of so many factors here, but we tried to kind of flip that on its head with the second example, where we showed more of a variable demand pricing, and using that auto start, auto pause feature in Snowflake can really save you a ton of hours. And then over on the Azure Synapse side, maybe you're only running it during your business hours or something like that. So there's so many different ways to look at pricing, and so many different organizational specific use cases. We'd be happy to dive deep on that with anyone, but it's hard to wrap up at a high level to say, oh, this is the one to pick based off of price alone, if that's your driving decision point. So just a couple things to think about there. And then a little bit of a recap table to kind of show maybe strengths and weaknesses of each platform. I guess I know Gary and Reeves could probably argue certain points on every single line here. Reeves, one of the last things we talked about was that SQL store procedure. You want to touch on that, because we didn't dive into that.
That's one. Yeah, that's the one feature that I gave you guys. So right now it's in Snowflake, they have stored procedures, but they're JavaScript stored procedures, and they're a little different than the stored procedures that everyone's really accustomed to using. And one of those differences is the fact that a stored procedure cannot return result sets. A current JavaScript stored procedure in Snowflake cannot return result sets. So just trying to be transparent. If you're a heavy stored procedure shop, there will be a little bit of pain in converting those over to JavaScript, but it's actually not that difficult. But there's also the fact that you're not going to be pulling back results from stored procedures. So there's just a little bit different. And that's the thing that I want to call it out. And that's why it's asterisks, because it is on the roadmap to add SQL stored procedures. So that is something they're doing. It's just something that they don't currently.
Gotcha. And Gary, anything you want to point at the high level here on the Azure Synapse column, maybe you don't agree with or you think should be a heavy consideration?
No, I mean, I think I already mentioned, kind of the ease of use thing. I mean, I guess that's a preference, but I mean, they're both great platforms. If you're a Microsoft shop already, I mean, I think Synapse makes sense. But if you're not, and maybe you're already heavily invested, like in an ETL tool like Informatica or DataStage, I mean, Snowflake is definitely a great option as well.
All right, that sounds great. Well, Mike, I think we're going to hand it back over to you at this point, but that kind of finishes our comparison of the two products.
Thanks, gentlemen. That was a pretty seamless between the three of you. Everybody stick around. We got some questions here in the question panel. I'm just going to run through a couple of things here. As you can tell, there's a lot to consider when trying to decide which one is the best data platform for you. So we at Senturus, we do this all day, every day. We get out of bed in the morning, put on our pants, eat some breakfast, and we can help you do this to evaluate your unique environments and requirements and provide unbiased recommendations, whether that's cloud, hybrid, or on-prem, give you best practices to optimize your spend and performance, as well as guiding you and or even executing the implementation. So we have that experience across these different vendors and can offer this expertise in a truly unbiased fashion. Quickly about Senturus, we concentrate our expertise, as I said, solely on business intelligence with a depth of knowledge across the entire BI stack. Our clients know us for providing clarity from the chaos of complex business requirements, disparate data sources, and constantly moving targets. We've made a name for ourselves based on our strength at bridging the gap between IT and business users. We deliver solutions that give you access to reliable analysis-ready data across your organization so you can quickly and easily get answers at the point of impact in the form of the decisions you make and the actions you take. Our consultants are leading experts in the field of analytics with years of pragmatic real-world expertise and experience advancing the state of the art. We're so confident in our team and our methodology that we back our projects with a 100% money-back guarantee that is unique in the industry. And we've been doing this for a long time, about 2 decades at this point, over 1,300 clients and 2,500 successful projects working across the spectrum from the Fortune 500 down to the mid-market, solving business problems across virtually every different industry and functional areas, including the Office of Finance, Sales and Marketing, Manufacturing, Operations, HR, and IT. Our team here at Senturus is both large enough to meet all your business analytics needs, yet small enough to provide personalized attention. We do, again, invite you to visit our Senturus.com Senturus resources site and bookmark that. You find today's webinar, other webinars, and a bunch of other tips and tricks and great things BI, including our fabulous up-to-the-minute, easily consumable blog. In terms of upcoming events similar to this one, we have an anomaly here. We have our Power Query Editor Jumpstart that we're going to be doing actually on a Wednesday. And then we have, which is next Wednesday, same time. And then we'll be doing 6 ways to publish and share Tableau dashboards a couple Thursdays from then. So head on over to our resource page and register for that and keep an eye on it. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention our comprehensive BI training offerings. Bob mentioned the 3 platforms that we focus on here, analytics platforms that we focus on here at Senturus, Cognos, Power BI, and Tableau. And we offer training in all of those and are ideal for organizations running multiple platforms or those perhaps moving from one to the other. We offer all the different modes, tailored group sessions, mentoring, instructor-led online courses, and self-paced e-learning, and can customize that to best meet the needs of your user community. And then finally, we provide hundreds of free resources on our website. Some of those I've already alluded to, and I've been committed to sharing our BI expertise for over a decade. And with that, I went through that very, very rapidly. We do have some questions that hopefully you gentlemen have had a chance to take a look at the panel here. And one of the questions was, can the version of Azure Data Factory and Synapse do that SSIS cannot? And how about the converse of that?
Yeah, so I mean, on the spot here, I don't know that I can pinpoint something that you can't do in one or the other. I think depending on how good you are, you could probably accomplish the same thing in both. But the idea is with Synapse, it's designed for the cloud, so it just makes it so easy to connect to all different types of sources, whether it be something that's already in Azure, or if you want to connect to something in AWS or Google Cloud. It's just the idea of that, with self-service and cloud in mind, this tool is designed for making it very easy to consume data from multiple sources. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, that's a pretty broad one. Data pipeline in Azure Synapse, is that the same as Azure Data Factory?
So it is mostly the same. So Azure Data Factory would be the full featured data set, where it has all the capabilities. In Synapse, there are a few key things that are missing, but of course, and as is usual with Microsoft, they have a roadmap, and things are on the schedule and just not there yet. But they are really the same. When you start working with them, they'll look and feel exactly the same, but there are a few settings that you might find aren't there in Synapse.
Got it. On the Snowflake side, when compute is turned off, what kind of performance can be expected from the first query issued?
Good question. When compute is stopped, it will start back up. Most of the time, it starts up in a very quick manner. I would say a couple seconds, if that. There are times I've seen where you're looking for a resource and it takes a little bit of time to spin up, but it's nothing like spinning up your own compute. It's almost instantaneous, and the only place that can become a bigger issue is if you're in a VPC, your own VPC. In that addition, you don't have this pool of you don't have as much of a pool spinning and waiting. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but within all the rest, it's pretty quick. I've seen, I think once or twice while I'm trying to do work where it took maybe 30 seconds or more, but not very often. So it spins up very quickly, and again, it can spin down, so you're not paying for that cost.
Great, good to know. So we actually have a great webinar up on the Senturus Resources website, where we discuss 5 different ways of doing ETL, and we do have several that talk about various different types of data preparation. Some are platform specific, some not. So definitely head on over to that resources page, and you can find that. That one, the one that we were referencing earlier, was presented by Andy Kinnear. So you can find that up there on the Senturus website. And then let's see. In terms of, there's one last question here about what are the key criteria that would make you choose one over the other. Gosh, that's the $1 million question, right? And I think I would argue that, I hate to say it, but it depends. And the key criteria are going to be the ones that are most important to your organization. Is it scale? Is it availability? Is it cost? And what are the relative importance of those specific features? So again, those are the sorts of things that we help people do all the time. So if you want to drill into that, we'd be happy to chat with you about that. I don't know if any of you have anything to add to that I might have overlooked, but that seems like.
No, I think that's a great summary.
All righty. Well, with that, it is the top of the hour, and I think we've gotten through all the questions that were in the panel. So with that, I'd like to thank our presenters, Bob and Reeves and Gary, and thank you all for taking time out of your day today to join us for the Knowledge Series presentation. If you have any business analytics needs, we do encourage you to reach out to us. You can email us at info@senturus.com. If you still use a phone, we got a 888 number down here for you. and we'd love to hear from you. So hopefully we'll see you all very soon on the next Knowledge Series presentation, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks a lot.